Throughout history, the Bible has contained mysteries that have fascinated and puzzled people for thousands of years. Hidden within its pages are secrets about giants who once walked the earth, mysterious figures without origins, and visions so incredible they seem impossible to understand. These aren't just stories, they're documented events that happen to real people in real places. Today, we're going to explore 7 of the most incredible mysteries found in the Bible, secrets that most people have never heard about. From beings that came down from heaven to create giants, to objects with supernatural powers that could kill with a touch. These mysteries will challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Each mystery builds upon the last, creating a timeline of supernatural events that span from the beginning of humanity to the end of time itself. Get ready to discover truths that have been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The first mystery begins with a question that has puzzled people for thousands of years. Who exactly were the sons of God mentioned in the Bible? When we read Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, we find these strange words. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. But who were these mysterious beings? The Hebrew words used here are Bene Elohim, which appears in other parts of the Bible when talking about heavenly beings. In the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, we read, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Here, these sons of God are clearly spiritual beings who could appear before God's throne. The same phrase shows up again in Job chapter 38, verse 7, where it says, When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy at the creation of the world. These weren't ordinary men. They were beings from heaven who had the power to take human form. They looked down at the earth and saw that human women were beautiful. But there was a big problem coming. What happened next was something that should never have occurred. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 show us that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. The word took here is important. It doesn't suggest they asked permission or courted these women properly. These powerful beings simply chose whoever they wanted and made them their wives. This wasn't love or marriage as God designed it. These heavenly beings used their supernatural strength to take human women as wives. This mixing between heavenly beings and humans was completely against God's plan. It was crossing a line that was never supposed to be crossed. The spiritual realm and the physical realm were meant to stay separate, but these sons of God broke that rule in the worst possible way. The result of these forbidden unions was shocking beyond belief. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 tells us there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The Hebrew word used for giants is Nephilim, which means fallen ones. These Nephilim were not just tall people, they were enormous, powerful beings that were part human and part something else entirely. They became famous throughout the ancient world for their incredible size and strength. The Bible calls them mighty men and men of renown, meaning everyone knew about them and feared them. These giants were unlike anything the world had ever seen. They possessed supernatural strength and abilities that came from their heavenly fathers, combined with physical bodies from their human mothers. Over the centuries, people have tried to explain this strange passage in different ways. Some believe the sons of God were the good descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, who married the bad descendants of Cain. But this explanation doesn't make sense when you think about it. Why would their children be giants? And why would God be so upset about good people marrying bad people that he would destroy the entire world? Others think these were human rulers or kings who called themselves gods. But again, this doesn't match what the Hebrew words actually mean throughout the rest of the Bible. It also doesn't explain why their children would be supernatural giants. The most straightforward reading of the text, using the same Hebrew words found elsewhere in the Bible, points to heavenly beings who left their proper place in heaven to come down to earth and interfere with humanity. When we look at archaeology, we find interesting discoveries that make us think. Ancient cultures all around the world have stories about giants and beings from the sky who came down to earth. In the Middle East, archaeologists have found unusually large skeletons and ancient texts that talk about giant people living in various regions. While we must be careful not to claim more than the evidence actually shows, these discoveries from different cultures and time periods make us wonder, why would so many separate civilizations have similar stories about giants if there wasn't some truth behind them? Ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other regions describe encounters with giant beings who possessed supernatural abilities. These accounts line up remarkably well with what the Bible tells us about the Nephilim. The mixing of heavenly beings with humans corrupted everything on earth. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5 says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." The world became so evil and corrupted that God decided to start completely over. Verse 11 tells us, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." This corruption wasn't just about people being mean to each other. Something had gone wrong at the very core of human nature itself. The genetic mixing between heavenly beings and humans had created something that was never supposed to exist. God looked at what had happened to his perfect creation and saw that it had been completely ruined. The only solution was to wipe the slate clean and begin again with Noah and his family. Some ancient books that aren't included in our Bible today, like the Book of Enoch, give us more details about these events. They call these heavenly beings watchers and describe how they not only took human wives, but also taught humans things they weren't supposed to know. According to these books, the watchers taught people how to make weapons of war, practice magic and sorcery, use makeup and jewelry, and perform astrology. They shared heavenly secrets that were meant to stay in heaven. While these books aren't part of the Bible, they help us understand what people in ancient times believed about these mysterious events. These writings suggest that the corruption wasn't just physical through the giant offspring, but also spiritual and technological through forbidden knowledge. Here's where the mystery gets even more puzzling. Even after the great flood destroyed the world and all the giants, they appeared again later in history. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, tells us about when the Israelites sent spies into the promised land. "There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." The Hebrew word here is again Nephilim, the same word used before the flood. This creates a big puzzle. If all the giants died in the flood, how could they be in the promised land hundreds of years later? The Bible suggests that somehow the giant bloodline survived or returned. Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 20 mentions that was also regarded as a land of giants. Giants formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummim. These later giants lived throughout the promised land in different tribes, the Anakim, the Emim, the Zamzummim, and others. There was Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed was 13 feet long, according to Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11. There was Goliath of Gath, who stood over 9 feet tall, according to 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 4. The mystery of how giants returned after the flood remains one of the most puzzling questions in biblical history, setting the stage for the supernatural conflicts that would continue throughout Israel's journey to the Promised Land. The second mystery takes us to one of the strangest encounters in all of biblical history. After Abraham had just won a great battle against 4 powerful kings who had captured his nephew Lot, something unexpected happened. Genesis chapter 14, verse 18 tells us, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High." This meeting wasn't planned or announced. Abraham was returning home victorious from rescuing Lot and recovering all the stolen goods from Sodom and Gomorrah. Suddenly, this mysterious figure appeared as if from nowhere. He wasn't just any ordinary person. He was both a king and a priest, something that was extremely rare in ancient times. Most people were either rulers or religious leaders, but never both. What makes this meeting even more strange is that Melchizedek seemed to know exactly who Abraham was and what had just happened. He came prepared with bread and wine, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. Genesis chapter 14, verse 19 shows us what he said. "And he blessed him and said, 'Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth.'" The timing of this encounter was perfect, happening right at the moment when Abraham needed spiritual encouragement after his military victory. But who was this mysterious king-priest who appeared at exactly the right time? What makes Melchizedek truly mysterious is what the Bible doesn't tell us about him. In a book that carefully records family lines and genealogies for almost everyone, Melchizedek appears with no background information at all. We don't know who his father was, who his mother was, where he came from, or what happened to him afterward. Hebrews chapter 7 verse 3 makes this point very clear. "Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually." This is completely unusual in biblical records. Even the most important people in the Bible have their family backgrounds mentioned, but not Melchizedek. Think about it. Abraham's genealogy is given, Isaac's family is recorded, Jacob's descendants are listed in detail. Kings, priests, prophets, and even minor characters usually have some family information provided. But Melchizedek appears in the biblical record as if he existed outside of normal human family structures. This absence of genealogy isn't an accident or oversight. In ancient times, genealogies were extremely important, especially for kings and priests. You couldn't just claim to be a ruler or religious leader without proving your family line. Yet Melchizedek is presented as both king and priest, without any family credentials whatsoever. The mystery deepens when we discover that Melchizedek's priesthood was completely different from any other priesthood in the Bible. The Levitical priesthood, which came later through Moses, was based on family bloodlines. You had to be born into the tribe of Levi to serve as a priest. But Melchizedek's priesthood was different. It was eternal. Psalm 110 verse 4 contains a prophecy that says, "The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." This psalm was written by King David about the coming Messiah, connecting Melchizedek's priesthood to someone who would come much later in history. Hebrews chapter 7 verse 17 quotes this same psalm and applies it directly. For he testifies, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." The writer of Hebrews explains that this priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood because it doesn't depend on genealogy or death. It continues forever. What's remarkable is that Abraham, who was called the father of faith, actually paid tithes to Melchizedek. Genesis chapter 14 verse 20 says, "And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and he gave him a tithe of all." The person who received God's promises about becoming a great nation actually submitted to this mysterious priest-king by giving him a tenth of everything. Throughout history, people have wondered about Melchizedek's true identity. Some early church leaders believed he was actually a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, what theologians call a theophany. This would explain his eternal priesthood and his appearance without genealogy. Others have suggested he was an angel who took human form for this specific encounter with Abraham. Angels in the Bible sometimes appeared as men and performed priestly functions. The fact that he appeared suddenly and then disappeared from the biblical record supports this theory. Some Jewish traditions taught that Melchizedek was actually Shem, one of Noah's sons, who would have still been alive during Abraham's time according to biblical chronology. This would explain his knowledge of God Most High and his authority as both king and priest. However, this theory doesn't explain why his genealogy would be completely omitted if he was really Shem. The mystery remains unsolved because the Bible intentionally presents him as a figure without normal human origins or limitations, making him a perfect symbol of eternal priesthood. The items that Melchizedek brought to Abraham weren't random refreshments. Genesis chapter 14 verse 18 specifically mentions bread and wine, two elements that would become extremely significant throughout biblical history. These same elements would later be used in various religious ceremonies and would ultimately point to something much greater. Bread represented sustenance and life throughout the ancient world. It was the basic food that kept people alive. Wine represented joy, celebration, and covenant relationships. Together, bread and wine symbolized both physical and spiritual nourishment. What makes this offering even more meaningful is that it came after Abraham's victory in battle. Melchizedek wasn't just providing refreshment for a tired warrior. He was performing a priestly function by offering these symbolic elements. This was the first recorded instance of someone serving bread and wine in a religious context in the Bible. The fact that Melchizedek, as priest of God Most High, chose these specific elements suggests they carried deep spiritual meaning. He was acknowledging Abraham's victory while also pointing to spiritual truths that would be fully revealed much later in biblical history. Melchizedek was identified as King of Salem. But where exactly was Salem? Most scholars believe Salem was an early name for Jerusalem, but the Bible doesn't explicitly state this. Psalm 76 verse 2 says, "In Salem also is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion," which suggests Salem and Jerusalem are the same place. If Salem was indeed Jerusalem, then Melchizedek was ruling over what would later become the most important city in biblical history. This would mean he was the rightful king of the place where God would eventually establish his temple and where many of the most significant biblical events would occur. But Salem remains mysterious because we have no other historical records of this city during Melchizedek's time. There are no archaeological remains, no other ancient texts, no coins or inscriptions. It's as if Salem existed in a different realm, appearing in history only for this one encounter with Abraham. The name Salem itself means peace, which is significant. Melchizedek ruled over a city of peace, and his very name means King of Righteousness. So he was the King of Righteousness, ruling over the city of peace, titles that perfectly describe the ideal ruler. The connection between Melchizedek and the coming Messiah is one of the most important aspects of this mystery. Psalm 110 was written by King David as a prophecy about someone greater than himself. Verse 1 says, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool.'" Then verse 4 adds this crucial detail. "The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." David was prophesying about someone who would be both king and priest, just like Melchizedek. But this person would hold this position forever. This prophecy was revolutionary because in Israel, kings came from the tribe of Judah and priests came from the tribe of Levi. No one could be both king and priest under the law of Moses. But David was prophesying about someone who would have a different kind of priesthood, one like Melchizedek's that didn't depend on tribal heritage. Hebrews chapter 7 verses 11 to 17 explains how this prophecy was fulfilled. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there is also a change of the law. The writer goes on to explain that this new priest-king would be eternal, not subject to death like the Levitical priests who had to be replaced when they died. Early church fathers spent considerable time trying to understand who Melchizedek really was. Some, like Origen and Jerome, believed he was an angel who appeared in human form. They pointed to his sudden appearance and disappearance, his lack of genealogy, and his supernatural knowledge as evidence of his angelic nature. Other church leaders like Epiphanius taught that Melchizedek was the Holy Spirit in human form. They argued that only God himself could hold an eternal priesthood and appear without genealogy. This interpretation sees the encounter as a divine revelation to Abraham about the nature of eternal priesthood. Some patristic writers suggested that Melchizedek was a special creation of God, made specifically for this encounter with Abraham. They believed God created him as a mature man without parents, similar to how Adam was created, to serve as a symbol of eternal priesthood. Early church generally agreed on one thing: Melchizedek was more than just an ordinary human being. Whether he was an angel, a theophany, or a special creation, he represented something supernatural and eternal that pointed beyond himself to greater spiritual realities. What makes Melchizedek's mystery so compelling is that it remains unsolved. The Bible intentionally presents him as a figure who exists outside normal human categories, making him a perfect symbol of eternal priesthood and divine authority. His brief appearance in Abraham's life created a theological puzzle that would echo throughout biblical history, pointing forward to the ultimate priest-king who would come to rule forever. The third mystery takes us to one of the most incredible and puzzling visions ever recorded in human history. It happened to a young priest named Ezekiel who was living in exile by the Kibar River in Babylon. He was just 30 years old when something extraordinary occurred that would change his life forever. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 1 tells us exactly when it happened. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. The heavens literally opened up above him, revealing things that no human eye had ever seen before. This wasn't a dream or a feeling. Ezekiel was completely awake and aware of his surroundings. He could see the other Jewish exiles around him by the river, but suddenly the sky above him split open like a curtain being pulled back. What he saw next was so overwhelming that he struggled to find words to describe it. Verse 4 describes what came first. Then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself, and brightness was all around it, and radiating out of its midst like the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. This wasn't just weather. It was something supernatural approaching from the northern sky. The cloud was enormous and filled with fire that seemed to be alive, moving and swirling in ways that defied natural explanation. The light coming from it was brighter than anything Ezekiel had ever seen, with colors that seemed to glow from within. This was just the beginning of what would be the most detailed description of heavenly beings ever recorded in the Bible. As the fiery cloud came closer, Ezekiel began to see what was inside it. Verses 5 and 6 tell us, "Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings." These weren't ordinary angels. They were unlike anything that had ever been described before. Each creature had 4 different faces, and Ezekiel carefully describes what they looked like in verse 10. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man. Each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. Each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and each of the 4 had the face of an eagle. Think about how impossible this seems, one being with 4 completely different faces. The face of a man represented intelligence and reasoning. The face of a lion showed strength and courage. The face of an ox displayed service and sacrifice. The face of an eagle revealed swiftness and heavenly perspective. Together, these 4 faces seem to represent all of creation: wild animals, domestic animals, humans, and birds of the air. Verse 7 gives us more details about their appearance. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. Their feet weren't human feet, but were like polished metal that reflected light. These beings seemed to be made of materials that don't exist on Earth. Each creature had 4 wings, but they used them in a special way. Verse 11 explains, "Thus were their faces. Their wings stretched upward. 2 wings of each one touched one another, and 2 covered their bodies." 2 wings were used for flying and moving, while 2 wings covered their bodies out of reverence for God's presence. If the 4 living creatures weren't strange enough, Ezekiel then saw something even more puzzling. Verse 15 says, "Now as I looked at the living creatures, behold, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature with its 4 faces." These weren't ordinary wheels. They were supernatural objects that moved in ways that seemed impossible. Verse 16 gives us more details. "The appearance of the wheels and their workings was like the color of beryl, and all 4 had the same likeness." The appearance of their workings was, as it were, a wheel in the middle of a wheel. These wheels were made of a precious stone called beryl, which has a golden-green color. But the most puzzling part was that each wheel had another wheel inside, it perpendicular to the first. This design allowed the wheels to move in any direction without turning. Verse 17 explains, "When they moved, they went toward any one of 4 directions. They did not turn aside when they went. They could go forward, backward, left, or right without rotating." This was technology that was completely beyond anything that existed in Ezekiel's time. But the most shocking detail comes in verse 18. "As for their rims, they were so high that they were awesome, and their rims were full of eyes, all around the 4 of them. The outer edges of these wheels were covered with eyes, not decorations that looked like eyes, but actual eyes that could see. These wheels were alive and aware of everything around them." These wheel creatures are called ophanim in Hebrew, which means wheels or whirlwinds. They seem to be a different type of heavenly being, working together with the 4 living creatures in perfect harmony. Above all of these incredible creatures was something even more amazing. Verse 22 describes what Ezekiel saw next. "The likeness of the firmament above the heads of the living creatures was like the color of an awesome crystal stretched out over their heads. Above the creatures was what looked like a crystal platform or dome that was perfectly clear and reflected light in every direction." Verse 26 tells us what was on top of this crystal platform. "And above the firmament over their heads was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like a sapphire stone. On the likeness of the throne was a likeness with the appearance of a man. There was an actual throne made of sapphire, one of the most precious and beautiful stones known to ancient people. But sitting on this throne was someone who looked like a man, yet was clearly much more than human." Verse 27 gives us more details. Also from the appearance of his waist and upward I saw, as it were, the color of amber, with the appearance of fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his waist and downward I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire with brightness all around. This figure was surrounded by fire and light that seemed to come from within him. The description continues in verse 28. Like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness all around it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel realized he was seeing God's glory itself, manifested in a form he could barely comprehend. The rainbow colors surrounding the throne reminded Ezekiel of God's covenant promise. After the flood, even in this overwhelming vision of divine power, there were reminders of God's faithfulness and mercy to humanity. The crystal dome above the living creatures wasn't just beautiful, it was also the source of incredible sounds. Verse 24 describes what Ezekiel heard. When they went, I heard the noise of their wings, like the noise of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a tumult like the noise of an army. And when they stood still, they let down their wings. The sound of the creature's wings was like rushing water, but also like the voice of God himself speaking. It was so loud and powerful that it sounded like an entire army moving at once. But when they stopped moving, everything became perfectly quiet as they lowered their wings in reverence. Verse 25 adds another detail. A voice came from above the firmament that was over their heads. Whenever they stood and let down their wings, they heard a voice. The crystal dome wasn't just a platform, it was the place from which God's voice came. When the creatures heard this voice, they immediately stopped what they were doing and listened. The combination of sights and sounds created an overwhelming sensory experience. Ezekiel wasn't just seeing this vision, he was hearing the actual sounds of heaven, the voices of supernatural beings, and the voice of God himself. The crystal firmament seemed to be the boundary between the earthly realm and the divine realm, allowing communication between both worlds. The mystery deepened when Ezekiel had a second vision that helped explain the first one. This happened later when he was taken in a vision to the temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel chapter 10 verse 1 describes what he saw. And I looked, and there in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubim, there appeared something like a sapphire stone, having the appearance of the likeness of a throne. In this second vision, Ezekiel realized that the 4 living creatures he had seen by the Kibar River were actually cherubim, a special type of angel that served directly in God's presence. Verse 14 gives us their identity. Each one had 4 faces. The first face was the face of a cherub, the second face the face of a man, the third the face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle. The description is almost identical to his first vision, but now Ezekiel understood what he was seeing. These weren't just mysterious creatures. They were the cherubim that guarded God's throne and carried his presence wherever he chose to go. Verse 20 confirms this understanding. This is the living creature I saw under the God of Israel by the river Chebar, and I knew they were cherubim. Ezekiel finally had a name for what he had experienced. These were the same beings that had been mentioned earlier in the Bible, like the cherubim that guarded the entrance to Eden after Adam and Eve were expelled. The second vision also showed Ezekiel that these cherubim could move God's presence from place to place. They weren't fixed in one location, but could transport the glory of God wherever he wanted to go. This explained how God could be present with his people even in exile in Babylon. Ever since Ezekiel recorded his vision, people have tried to understand what he actually saw. In modern times, some have suggested that Ezekiel was describing advanced technology that he didn't have words for. They point to the wheels within wheels, the eyes covering the rims, and the ability to move in any direction without turning as evidence of some kind of spacecraft or vehicle. Others have suggested that the four faces represent different aspects of God's character, and the wheels represent God's omnipresence, his ability to be everywhere at once. From this perspective, Ezekiel was seeing symbolic representations of spiritual truths rather than literal, physical objects. Some interpreters focus on the fact that Ezekiel was a priest who would have been familiar with the decorations in the temple. The cherubim, wheels, and precious stones were all elements that appeared in the temple's design. They suggest that Ezekiel was seeing the heavenly reality that the earthly temple was designed to represent. What makes the interpretation challenging is that Ezekiel insists he saw these things literally. He uses phrases like, "I saw" and "behold" throughout his description, emphasizing that this was a real visual experience, not just a symbolic dream or metaphor. Ezekiel's vision became the foundation for many other descriptions of heavenly beings and divine encounters throughout biblical and extra-biblical literature. The four living creatures appear again in the book of Revelation, where John sees similar beings around God's throne. Revelation chapter 4 verse 6 describes what John saw. Before the throne there was a sea of glass, like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were four living creatures full of eyes in front and in back. These creatures had the same four faces that Ezekiel described: man, lion, ox, and eagle. The wheels full of eyes also influenced later Jewish mystical literature, where they became known as the Ophanim and were described as one of the highest orders of angels. Jewish traditions developed elaborate descriptions of these wheel angels and their role in carrying God's throne through the heavens. The crystal firmament and sapphire throne became standard elements in descriptions of heavenly visions. Later prophets and visionaries would use similar language when trying to describe encounters with divine glory, showing how Ezekiel's detailed account provided a vocabulary for describing the indescribable. Daniel, Zechariah, and John in Revelation all drew upon the imagery that Ezekiel first recorded, creating a consistent biblical picture of what the throne room of heaven actually looks like. Ezekiel's vision wasn't just a one-time event. It was a revelation of heavenly realities that continue to exist and can still be seen by those whom God chooses to receive such visions. The mystery of Ezekiel's vision continues to challenge our understanding of the spiritual realm and God's presence in our world, revealing that there are dimensions of reality far beyond what our normal senses can perceive. The fourth mystery takes us into one of the most personal and extraordinary experiences ever recorded in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, revealed something that happened to him 14 years earlier, an experience so incredible that he wasn't even sure if he should talk about it. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 1, Paul begins by saying, "It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord." He was reluctant to share this experience because it was so personal and sacred. But the situation in Corinth forced him to reveal what had happened to defend his apostolic authority. Verse 2 contains the mysterious account. "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up to the third heaven." Paul speaks about himself in the third person, as if he was talking about someone else. This wasn't false modesty. He was genuinely overwhelmed by what had happened to him. The phrase "caught up" is the Greek word harpazo, which means to be seized or snatched away suddenly. This wasn't a gradual spiritual experience or a dream that developed slowly. Paul was instantly transported from wherever he was on earth to a realm that existed far beyond normal human experience. What makes this even more mysterious is that Paul himself didn't know if this happened to his physical body or just his spirit. After 14 years of thinking about it, he still couldn't figure out exactly what had occurred. All he knew for certain was that God had taken him to a place called the third heaven. Paul's confusion about whether this was a bodily or spiritual experience reveals just how real and overwhelming it was. Verse 3 repeats his uncertainty, "And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows." The repetition shows that this wasn't just a minor detail. It was something that really puzzled him. If this had been just a vision or a dream, Paul would have known it was spiritual. If it had been a physical transportation, he would have been aware of his body being moved. But this experience was so unique that it defied normal categories. Paul found himself in another realm without understanding exactly how he got there. This uncertainty is actually evidence of the experience's authenticity. If Paul had been making up this story to impress people, he would have given clear details about being physically transported or receiving a spiritual vision. Instead, his honest confusion about the nature of the experience shows that something genuinely supernatural had occurred. Throughout church history, saints and mystics have reported similar experiences where they weren't sure if they were in their bodies or outside of them during divine encounters. Paul's account became the template for understanding these kinds of mystical experiences where the normal boundaries between physical and spiritual reality seemed to disappear. Paul goes on to describe where he was taken and what he experienced. There, verse 4 tells us how he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Paradise wasn't just a beautiful garden. It was a specific location in the heavenly realm where God dwells. The word paradise comes from an ancient Persian word meaning walled garden or enclosed park. But in Jewish and Christian understanding, paradise referred to the place where the righteous go after death, the dwelling place of God where perfect peace and joy exist. This was the same paradise that Jesus promised to the thief on the cross in Luke chapter 23, verse 43. "Today you will be with me in paradise." What Paul heard there was described as inexpressible words. The Greek word aretos means things that cannot be spoken or are forbidden to be revealed. These weren't just difficult concepts that were hard to explain. They were communications that were literally impossible to put into human language. Paul also says these words were not lawful for a man to utter. This suggests that God specifically told him not to reveal what he had heard. There were divine secrets that were meant to stay in heaven, knowledge that humans weren't supposed to possess while still living on earth. Paul had been given access to heavenly information that came with strict restrictions about sharing it. The fact that Paul heard actual words means there was real communication happening in paradise. This wasn't just a visual experience. God or heavenly beings were speaking to him, sharing information that was too sacred and powerful for earthly revelation. To understand Paul's reference to the third heaven, we need to know how Jewish people in his time understood the structure of the universe. They believed there were multiple levels of heaven, each higher and more glorious than the last. The first heaven was the atmospheric heaven, the sky where birds fly and clouds form. This was the physical space immediately above the earth that humans could see with their eyes. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 11 refers to this when it mentions a land of hills and valleys which drinks water from the rain of heaven. The second heaven was the stellar heaven, the space where the sun, moon, and stars existed. This was the realm that ancient people could observe at night, containing all the celestial bodies that moved across the sky. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 describes this heaven. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night." The third heaven was the dwelling place of God himself, the highest realm where divine beings lived and where God's throne was located. This was the heaven that existed beyond physical space and time, the realm of pure spirit and divine glory. This is the heaven referenced in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 30, when Solomon prayed, "Here in heaven, your dwelling place." Paul was taken beyond the physical universe to the very throne room of God. He had been transported to the highest possible realm, the place where only God and the highest angels normally dwelt. This explains why the experience was so overwhelming and why the revelations he received were too sacred to share. The extraordinary revelation Paul received came with an unexpected consequence. Verses 7 and 8 tell us, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." The thorn in the flesh was some kind of physical or spiritual affliction that caused Paul ongoing suffering. The Greek word skolops refers to a sharp stake or splinter that causes constant pain. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a serious problem that significantly affected Paul's life and ministry. Paul describes this thorn as a messenger of Satan, indicating that it had a demonic origin. However, God allowed it to remain in Paul's life for a specific purpose, to keep him humble despite the incredible revelations he had received. The experience of visiting the third heaven was so glorious that without this balancing affliction, Paul might have become proud and self-exalted. Paul prayed 3 times for God to remove this thorn, but God refused. Instead, in verse 9, God gave him this answer, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." God chose to leave the thorn in place because it served an important spiritual purpose in Paul's life. This shows us that even the most extraordinary spiritual experiences come with responsibilities and sometimes with difficulties. The higher the revelation, the greater the need for humility and dependence on God's grace. Paul's experience in the third heaven wasn't his first supernatural encounter. Acts chapter 9 records his dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus when Jesus appeared to him in a blinding light. Verse 3 tells us, "As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven." This earlier vision was different from his third heaven experience. On the Damascus road, Paul was physically knocked to the ground and temporarily blinded. There was no question that this was a physical experience that others around him could partially witness. Acts chapter 9 verse 7 says, "And the men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one." Later in Acts chapter 22 verse 17, Paul mentions another vision he had while praying in the temple in Jerusalem. "Now it happened, when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, that I was in a trance and saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me.'" These multiple visions show that Paul had an ongoing relationship with the supernatural realm. His third heaven experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of divine encounters that guided his ministry. Each vision served a different purpose. His Damascus Road experience converted him, his temple vision directed his ministry, and his third heaven experience gave him revelations too sacred to share. Paul's account of being caught up to the third heaven fits into a broader tradition of heavenly ascension stories that were common in Jewish literature during the Second Temple period. Jewish writers had produced numerous accounts of righteous people being taken up to heaven to receive divine revelations. The book of 1 Enoch, which was widely read in Paul's time, contains detailed descriptions of Enoch being taken through multiple levels of heaven and shown divine secrets. 2. Enoch describes similar journeys through 7 heavens, each with its own unique characteristics and inhabitants. The Apocalypse of Abraham tells of Abraham being taken up to heaven and shown the divine throne room, complete with 4-faced living creatures similar to what Ezekiel saw. The Testament of Levi describes Levi ascending through 3 heavens and receiving priestly revelations. What makes Paul's account unique is that he was reluctant to talk about it and refused to share the specific revelations he received. Most of the other ascension accounts in Jewish literature provided detailed descriptions of what the visionaries saw and heard. Paul's restraint actually makes his account more credible. He had clearly been taught that some heavenly knowledge was too sacred to reveal. These traditions show that Paul's Jewish audience would have understood what he meant by being caught up to the 3rd heaven. They were familiar with the concept of divine ascensions and would have recognized this as a legitimate form of prophetic revelation. Paul's 3rd heaven experience can be compared to similar encounters that other biblical prophets had with the divine realm. Isaiah chapter 6 verses 1-2 records Isaiah's vision. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim, each one had 6 wings. Isaiah's vision took place in the heavenly temple, and like Paul, he received revelations that transformed his ministry. However, Isaiah was told to share his vision and was given a specific prophetic message to deliver to Israel. Paul, on the other hand, was commanded to keep his revelations secret. Ezekiel's visions of God's throne room were incredibly detailed and were meant to be recorded for future generations. Daniel was taken in visions to see future events and was told to write down what he saw, even though some of it was to be sealed until the end times. What distinguishes Paul's experience is its private nature. While other prophets were given visions to share with God's people, Paul's 3rd heaven revelation was primarily for his own spiritual development and apostolic authentication. The content was too sacred for public revelation, but the fact that it happened validated his authority as an apostle. This shows that God gives different types of revelations for different purposes. Some visions are meant to be shared publicly, others are meant to guide personal ministry, and some, like Paul's, are meant to remain private while still serving important spiritual purposes. The mystery of Paul's 3rd heaven experience reminds us that there are aspects of God's nature and heavenly realities that remain hidden from human understanding. Even the most faithful servants of God are only given glimpses of eternal truths, and some of those glimpses are too sacred to share with others. Paul's reluctant testimony about his supernatural encounter gives us a window into the vast spiritual realm that exists beyond our normal perception, while respecting the boundaries that God has established around the most sacred revelations. The 5th mystery takes us to one of the most puzzling religious objects mentioned in the Bible, the Urim and Thummim. These sacred items were placed inside the breastplate of judgment worn by Israel's high priest, but their exact nature and origin remain completely unknown. The Bible mentions them as if everyone already knew what they were without ever explaining how they were made or where they came from. Exodus chapter 28 verse 30 gives us our first mention of these mysterious objects. And you shall put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. So Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel over his heart before the Lord continually. God commanded Moses to place these items in the high priest's breastplate, but he never explained what they actually were. The names themselves give us some clues about their purpose. Urim comes from the Hebrew word meaning lights or flames, while Thummim means perfections or completeness. Together, they seem to represent illumination and wholeness, the perfect revelation of God's will in any situation. What makes their origins so mysterious is that unlike every other item in the tabernacle, God gave Moses no instructions for making. The Urim and Thummim, the golden lampstand, the altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, all of these came with detailed construction plans. But the Urim and Thummim appeared in the biblical record as if they already existed and were well known to Moses. Some scholars believe they were ancient objects that had been passed down from Abraham's time, possibly connected to the mysterious priesthood of Melchizedek. Others suggest they might have been given directly by God without human craftsmanship, similar to how the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments were written by God's own finger. The Urim and Thummim served as God's primary method for giving direct yes or no answers to Israel's leaders. When the high priest needed to know God's will about military campaigns, leadership decisions, or other important matters, he would consult these sacred objects and receive immediate divine guidance. Samuel chapter 28, verse 6 shows us how this worked in practice. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. This verse reveals that the Urim and presumably the Thummim were one of three primary ways God communicated with his people: through dreams, through the sacred stones, or through prophetic messages. The consultation process seems to have involved the high priest asking specific questions that could be answered with a simple yes or no. Numbers chapter 27 verse 21 describes how this was supposed to work. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation. The high priest would stand in the holy place, wearing the breastplate with the Urim and Thummim inside, and ask God specific questions on behalf of the people. The sacred objects would then provide clear answers that everyone could understand and follow. This wasn't guesswork or interpretation, it was direct divine communication through physical objects. Ezra chapter 2 verse 63 shows that this method was still expected to work even after the Babylonian exile. And the governor said to them that they should not eat of the most holy things till a priest could consult with the Urim and Thummim. The returning exiles knew they needed these sacred objects to make proper religious decisions, but they were no longer available. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Urim and Thummim is that the Bible never tells us what they actually looked like or what they were made of. Every other sacred object in the tabernacle and temple is described in careful detail: the measurements, materials, colors, and construction methods. But these most important decision-making tools are mentioned without any physical description whatsoever. The breastplate that contained them is described in great detail in Exodus chapter 28, verses 15 to 21. You shall make the breastplate of judgment, artistically woven according to the workmanship of the ephod. You shall make it of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and fine woven linen. You shall make it. It shall be doubled into a square. A span shall be its length, and a span shall be its width. The breastplate had 12 precious stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel, each stone carefully identified by name and position. But when it comes to the Urim and Thummim that were placed inside this elaborate breastplate, we get no description at all. Were they stones? Were they metal objects? Were they some other type of material entirely? The Bible simply doesn't tell us. Some Jewish traditions suggest they were flat stones with Hebrew letters written on them that could be arranged to spell out divine messages. Others believe they were precious gems that would light up or change color to indicate God's answers. Still others think they might have been small metal objects that would move or point in specific directions when consulted. The fact that they could fit inside the breastplate tells us they were relatively small objects, probably no larger than a few inches in any direction. They were portable enough for the high priest to wear them constantly, yet significant enough to serve as the primary means of divine communication for the entire nation of Israel. Throughout Israel's history, the Urim and Thummim were used to make some of the most important decisions the nation ever faced. These weren't used for minor personal questions, but for matters that affected the entire people of God. When Joshua needed to know how to conquer the Promised Land, Numbers chapter 27 verse 21 established the protocol. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. Military campaigns, territorial divisions, and leadership appointments were all decided through consultation with these sacred objects. Samuel chapter 14 gives us a detailed example of how they were used during King Saul's reign. When Saul wanted to know who had violated his oath during a battle, verses 41-42 tell us, "Therefore Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, 'Give a perfect lot.' So Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. And Saul said, 'Cast lots between my son Jonathan and me.' So Jonathan was taken." The perfect lot was a reference to the Urim and Thummim providing clear, accurate guidance. Through this divine consultation, Saul discovered that his own son, Jonathan, had unknowingly broken the oath by eating honey during the battle. The sacred objects didn't just give yes or no answers, they could identify specific individuals when properly consulted. Samuel chapter 23, verses 9-12 shows David using them when he was fleeing from Saul. When David knew that Saul plotted evil against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then David said, "O Lord God of Israel, your servant has certainly heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will come down." David received specific, detailed answers to complex questions about Saul's future actions and the loyalty of the people of Keilah. This shows that the Urim and Thummim could provide more than simple yes or no responses when the situation required more detailed guidance. One of the most significant mysteries surrounding the Urim and Thummim is their complete disappearance from biblical history. After the Babylonian exile, when the Jews returned from captivity to rebuild the temple, these essential objects were nowhere to be found. Ezra chapter 2 verse 63 records the problem this created. "And the governor said to them that they should not eat of the most holy things till a priest could consult with the Urim and Thummim." The returning exiles knew they needed these sacred objects to make proper religious decisions, but they were completely unavailable. This created a major crisis for the restored Jewish community. How could they know God's will about important religious and civil matters without their primary means of divine communication? The absence of the Urim and Thummim meant that certain religious privileges had to be suspended until they could be recovered or replaced. Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 65 repeats the same problem. "And the governor said to them that they should not eat of the most holy things till a priest could consult with Urim and Thummim." This wasn't a temporary shortage. It was a permanent loss that affected the entire religious system of post-exilic Judaism. What happened to these sacred objects? Several theories have been proposed. They might have been destroyed when the Babylonians burned Solomon's temple. They could have been hidden by faithful priests before the destruction and their hiding place forgotten during the 70 years of exile. They might have been carried off to Babylon as valuable religious artifacts and never returned. Some Jewish traditions suggest that certain sacred objects, including the Urim and Thummim, were hidden by the prophet Jeremiah before the Babylonian invasion, and would not be recovered until the Messiah came to restore all things. While the Urim and Thummim are usually mentioned together, there's evidence that they functioned differently and provided different types of divine responses. The fact that they have different names and meanings suggests they served distinct purposes in the consultation process. Some scholars believe that Urim provided negative responses, indicating no or revealing problems, while Thummim provided positive responses, indicating yes or showing approval. This would explain why they were both needed for complete divine guidance. One revealed what not to do, while the other confirmed what should be done. Jewish traditions preserved in the EU. Talmud suggests that the Urim would light up or become visible when the answer was negative, while the Thummim would respond when the answer was positive. This interpretation fits with their names: lights for illuminating problems and perfections for confirming right choices. Samuel chapter 14 verse 37 might give us a clue about how they worked differently. So Saul asked counsel of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer him that day. When God chose not to respond through the Urim and Thummim, it might mean that neither object activated, indicating that this wasn't the right time to ask that particular question. The silence of the Urim and Thummim was itself a form of divine communication. When neither object responded, it told the high priest that God was either displeased with the questioner or that the timing wasn't right for that particular decision. The Urim and Thummim existed in a world where many cultures used various objects and methods to seek divine guidance. However, Israel's sacred stones were fundamentally different from pagan divination practices in several important ways. Unlike the magical practices of surrounding nations, the Urim and Thummim only worked through Israel's covenant relationship with God. They weren't magical objects that automatically provided answers. They were instruments through which the living God chose to communicate with his chosen people. Other ancient cultures used dice, arrows, animal livers, and other objects for divination, but these practices were based on superstition and manipulation of spiritual forces. Israel's method was based on God's promise to guide his people through these specially designated objects when consulted by the authorized high priest. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 10 to 11 specifically forbade the divination practices used by other nations. "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead." The Urim and Thummim were the God-approved alternative to these forbidden practices. Instead of trying to manipulate spiritual forces or contact the dead, Israel had a direct, authorized method for receiving divine guidance through objects that God himself had designated for this purpose. After the return from Babylonian exile, various attempts were made to recreate or replace the missing Urim and Thummim. Jewish religious leaders recognized that their absence was a serious problem that needed to be addressed somehow. Some priests during the Second Temple period claimed to have recreated the Urim and Thummim based on traditional descriptions and religious knowledge. However, these attempts were never fully accepted by the Jewish community because there was no way to verify their authenticity or effectiveness. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, claimed that the Urim and Thummim had stopped working even before the Babylonian exile. He wrote that the stones on the high priest's breastplate used to shine brightly when consulted, but this phenomenon had ceased about 200 years before his time. Other Jewish sources suggest that the loss of the Urim and Thummim was one of several sacred objects that would only be restored when the Messiah came to establish God's kingdom. Along with the Ark of the Covenant, the original menorah, and other temple treasures, the Urim and Thummim were considered part of the full restoration that would come in Messianic times. The absence of these sacred objects during the Second Temple period meant that Jewish leaders had to rely more heavily on prophetic messages, scriptural interpretation, and rabbinical wisdom for making important religious decisions. This shift toward textual study and interpretive tradition became a defining characteristic of post-exilic Judaism. The mystery of the Urim and Thummim reminds us that God provided specific, practical methods for his people to know his will in different historical periods. While we no longer have access to these particular objects, the principle remains that God desires to guide his people and will provide appropriate means for discerning his will in every generation. The sixth mystery centers on the most powerful and feared object in all of biblical history, the Ark of the Covenant. This wasn't just a religious symbol or decorative piece of furniture. It was a supernatural object that could kill people with a single touch and demonstrate God's power in ways that defied natural explanation. Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 to 11, give us the exact specifications that God provided to Moses. "And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside you shall overlay it, and shall make on it a molding of gold all around." These measurements weren't random. A cubit was about 18 inches, making the ark approximately 45 inches. Long, 27 inches wide, and 27 inches high. The acacia wood was chosen because it was extremely durable and resistant to decay. But the wood was completely covered with pure gold, inside and outside, making it incredibly valuable and giving it a supernatural appearance. Verse 12 continues, "You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in its 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side and 2 rings on the other side." These weren't decorative rings, they were functional elements that allowed the ark to be carried without anyone touching it directly. Verses 13 to 14 explain the carrying method. "And you shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, that the ark may be carried by them. Even the carrying poles were covered with gold and were never to be removed from the rings. This ensured that no one would ever accidentally touch the ark itself during transport. The materials used weren't just expensive, they were symbolic. Gold represented divinity and eternal value. Acacia wood represented humanity and earthly life. The combination of these materials showed that the ark was the meeting place between God and mankind, where the divine and human realms intersected. The most important part of the ark was its lid, called the mercy seat or atonement cover. This wasn't just a simple cover, it was where God himself promised to dwell and communicate with his people. Exodus chapter 25 verse 17 describes its construction. "You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width." The mercy seat was made of solid gold, matching the length and width of the ark perfectly. This was where the blood of sacrificial animals would be sprinkled once a year on the Day of Atonement. Verses 18-19 detail the most remarkable feature. "And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of it of one piece with the mercy seat." These weren't separate statues placed on top of the ark. They were carved from the same piece of gold as the mercy seat itself. This required incredible skill and craftsmanship, as the entire mercy seat with its cherubim had to be formed from a single block of pure gold using only hammers and other hand tools. Verse 20 describes their position. "And the cherubim shall Stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. The cherubim faced each other with their wings touching above the mercy seat, creating a sacred space between them. This design created a throne room in miniature. The cherubim represented the living creatures that surrounded God's throne in heaven, and the space between their wings was where God's presence would dwell on earth. It wasn't just symbolic. God's actual presence would manifest in this specific location. The supernatural power of the ark became terrifyingly clear when it fell into enemy hands. During a battle with Israel, the Philistines captured the ark and took it as a trophy of war. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Samuel chapter 5 verse 2 tells us what happened first. When the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. Dagon was their chief god, represented by a large statue in their main temple. They placed the ark next to Dagon's statue as if it were just another religious object. But the next morning brought a shocking surprise. Verse 3 says, "And when the people of Ashdod arose early in the morning, there was Dagon fallen on its face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set it in its place again." Their mighty god statue had fallen face down before the ark. As if worshipping the God of Israel, the Philistines set Dagon back up, thinking it was just an accident. But verse 4 shows what happened the second night. "And when they arose early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen on its face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. The head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were broken off on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso was left to him." This wasn't just the statue falling over, it was being systematically destroyed. The head and hands were broken off, leaving only the fish-like body of Dagon intact. The message was clear. The God of Israel was more powerful than any pagan deity, but the physical destruction was just the beginning. Verse 6 reveals what happened to the people. "But the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he ravaged them and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. The ark brought disease and suffering wherever the Philistines took it. Even among God's own people, the ark's power was deadly to those who didn't treat it with proper respect." This became tragically clear during King David's reign when he decided to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Samuel chapter 6 verse 3 describes how they transported it. "So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart." This seemed like a respectful way to move the ark, using a brand new cart driven by men from the family that had been caring for it. But there was a problem. This wasn't how God had commanded the ark to be transported. It was supposed to be carried by Levites using the gold-covered poles, not placed on a cart like ordinary cargo. Verse 6 tells us what happened next. "And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled." The oxen pulling the cart stumbled, and the ark started to tip over. Uzzah instinctively reached out to steady it, thinking he was protecting this sacred object from falling to the ground. His good intentions didn't matter. Verse 7 records the immediate consequence. "Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God." Uzzah died instantly the moment his hand touched the ark. One touch was all it took. This wasn't cruelty. It was the inevitable result of coming into direct contact with God's holiness without proper preparation. The ark contained the actual presence of God, and sinful human flesh couldn't survive direct contact with perfect holiness. David was so shaken by this incident that he refused to move the ark any further. Verse 9 says, "David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, 'How can the ark of the Lord come to me?' It took months before David worked up the courage to try again, and the second time he followed God's instructions exactly. One of the greatest mysteries in biblical history is what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. When the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BC, they took many valuable objects back to Babylon as spoils of war. But the Ark is never mentioned among the items that were captured or destroyed. Kings chapter 25, verses 13 to 17 give a detailed list of what the Babylonians took. The bronze pillars that were in the house of the Lord, and the carts and the bronze. See that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke in pieces and carried their bronze to Babylon. They also took away the pots, the shovels, the trimmers, the spoons, and all the bronze utensils with which the priests ministered. The passage continues listing golden objects, silver items, and other temple treasures that were carried off to Babylon. But nowhere in this inventory is the Ark of the Covenant mentioned. This is especially strange because it would have been the most valuable single object in the entire temple, made of solid gold and representing the heart of Jewish worship. What happened to it? Several theories have been proposed. Some believe it was destroyed by the Babylonians and its gold melted down, but this seems unlikely given how carefully they preserved other valuable temple objects. Others think it might have been hidden by faithful priests before the Babylonian invasion. Maccabees, a book written during the intertestamental period, claims that the prophet Jeremiah hid the ark in a cave on Mount Nebo, where Moses had viewed the promised land before his death. According to this account, the location was sealed and would remain unknown until God gathered his people together again. Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 16 contains a prophecy that might explain the ark's disappearance. Then it shall come to pass, when you are multiplied and increased in the land in those days, says the Lord, that they will say no more, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind, nor shall they remember it, nor shall they visit it, nor shall it be made again. This suggests that the ark's disappearance was part of God's plan for a new covenant that wouldn't require physical objects to mediate his presence with his people. The mystery of the ark's location has sparked numerous theories and expeditions throughout history. Each theory has its supporters and claims to evidence, but none has been definitively proven. The Ethiopian theory is one of the most persistent. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims to possess the original Ark of the Covenant in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, Ethiopia. According to their tradition, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik the Phaeon, the supposed son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Queen of Sheba was actually the Queen of Ethiopia, and when she visited Solomon, they had a son together. This son later visited his father in Jerusalem and secretly took the ark back to Ethiopia for safekeeping. The Ethiopian Church claims that the ark has remained in their custody ever since, guarded by a single monk who is the only person allowed to see it. However, this theory has significant problems. There's no biblical evidence that Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son together, and the Ethiopian traditions weren't recorded until many centuries after the supposed events. Additionally, the Ethiopian Church has never allowed independent verification of their claim. The hidden cave theory suggests that the ark was concealed somewhere in or around Jerusalem before the Babylonian destruction. Some believe it's hidden in caves beneath the Temple Mount, while others think it might be in the Judean wilderness, where other ancient treasures have been discovered. The Temple Mount theory is particularly intriguing because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which included a mysterious document called the Copper Scroll. This ancient text appears to be a treasure map, listing the locations where temple treasures were hidden before the destruction of Jerusalem. Some interpretations of this scroll suggest that the ark might be buried beneath the Temple Mount itself. Archaeological Excavations around Jerusalem have uncovered numerous ancient hiding places where valuable objects were concealed during times of war. The Jewish practice of hiding sacred objects before invasions was well established, making it plausible that the ark was similarly protected. The most supernatural aspect of the ark was the visible presence of God that appeared above it. This divine presence was called the Shekinah, from a Hebrew word meaning dwelling or settling. It wasn't just a symbol of God's presence, it was the actual manifestation of God's glory in physical form. Exodus chapter 25, verse 22 contains God's promise about this manifestation. "And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel." This wasn't a one-time event, it was an ongoing promise. God would regularly appear above the ark to communicate with Moses and the high priests. The space between the cherubim became the earthly throne room of the Almighty, where heaven and earth intersected. Numbers chapter 7, verse 89 describes what this looked like. "Now, when Moses went into the tabernacle of meeting to speak with him, he heard the voice of one speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the ark of the testimony, from between the two cherubim. Thus he spoke to him." Moses could actually hear God's voice coming from the space above the mercy seat. This wasn't an internal spiritual experience or a vision. It was audible communication that occurred in a specific physical location. During the wilderness wanderings, the Shekinah glory was visible as a cloud by day and fire by night that rested above the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from above the ark, it was the signal for Israel to break camp and continue their journey. When the cloud settled, they knew to stop and set up camp. Kings chapter 8, verses 10-11 describes what happened when the ark was placed in Solomon's temple. "And it came to pass, when the priests came out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." The Shekinah glory was so intense that the priests couldn't even remain in the building. God's visible presence filled the entire temple, making it impossible for ordinary humans to function in that environment. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't just an earthly object, it was a copy of something that existed in heaven. The entire tabernacle and temple system was designed to reflect heavenly realities, with the Ark serving as the earthly representation of God's heavenly throne. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24 explains this connection. "For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." The earthly Holy of Holies was a copy of the real Holy of Holies in heaven. Revelation chapter 11, verse 19 gives us a glimpse of the heavenly original. "Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. And there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail. John saw the true ark of the covenant in heaven, surrounded by supernatural phenomena that demonstrated God's power." This means that the earthly ark was always meant to be temporary. It served its purpose by allowing God to dwell among his people during the Old Testament period, but it pointed to something greater: direct access to God's presence through spiritual rather than physical means. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19 describes this new access. "Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus." The physical ark and its rituals were replaced by a spiritual reality that allows every believer to approach God's throne directly. The mystery of the missing ark reminds us that God's presence is no longer confined to a single physical object in a specific location. The same power that once dwelt above the mercy seat between the cherubim is now available to every person who approaches God through faith, making the entire world a potential holy of holies where divine and human can meet. The seventh and final mystery takes us to the most complex and symbolic book in the entire Bible, the book of Revelation. Written by the Apostle John while he was imprisoned on the island of Patmos, this prophetic vision contains mysteries about the end of the world that have puzzled scholars for nearly 2,000 years. The mystery begins with a scroll that no one in heaven or earth could open. Revelation chapter 5 verses 1 to 2 describe this scene. And I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll written inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. Then I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and to loose its seals?" This wasn't an ordinary scroll. It contained God's final plan for human history. The 7 seals that secured it weren't just physical closures, but spiritual barriers that prevented anyone from understanding God's ultimate purposes for the world. Only one person in all of creation was found worthy to break these seals and reveal their contents. Revelation chapter 5, verse 5 identifies who could open the scroll. But one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals." This was Jesus Christ, represented both as a conquering lion and as a sacrificial lamb. When the first seal was opened, in Revelation chapter 6 verse 2, John saw, "And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." This rider represented conquest and political domination that would characterize the end times. The second seal revealed a red horse, whose rider was granted to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword, Revelation 6:4. This represented warfare and violence on a global scale. The third seal showed a black horse whose rider held scales, representing economic collapse and famine. The fourth seal revealed a pale horse whose rider was death itself, given power to kill 1/4 of the earth's population through war, hunger, disease, and wild beasts. The fifth seal was different. It revealed the souls of martyrs crying out for justice, showing that spiritual persecution would intensify during the end times. The sixth seal brought cosmic disturbances as the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. Revelation 6:12. After the seals were opened, John witnessed an even more intense series of judgments announced by 7 trumpet blasts. These weren't just symbolic warnings. They represented actual supernatural disasters that would devastate the earth. Revelation chapter 8 verse 7 describes the first trumpet. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. This judgment would destroy 1/3 of all vegetation on earth through supernatural fire mixed with blood. The second trumpet brought an even more terrifying disaster. Verse 8 says, "Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea became blood. This massive object, possibly an asteroid or supernatural missile, would contaminate 1/3 of all ocean water and kill 1/3 of all sea life." The third trumpet introduced a fallen star called wormwood that would poison fresh water sources. The fourth trumpet darkened 1/3 of the sun, moon, and stars, reducing light on earth by 1/3. These weren't natural disasters, but supernatural interventions that would dramatically alter the earth's environment. Revelation chapter 9 Verse 1 describes the fifth trumpet. Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. This fallen star was actually a spiritual being who would open a supernatural prison and release demonic creatures that had been confined there since ancient times. Verses 3 to 5 describe what emerged. Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were given authority to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. These weren't ordinary locusts, but supernatural beings that would torture unbelievers for 5 months. Their appearance was terrifying. The shape of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. Verses 7 to 8. The sixth trumpet released 4 fallen angels who had been bound at the Euphrates River, along with an army of 200 million supernatural horsemen who would kill a third of mankind. The seventh trumpet announced the final phase of God's judgment on earth. In the middle of these judgments, John witnessed a cosmic battle between good and evil that had been raging since the beginning of time. Revelation chapter 12 verse 1 describes an incredible sight. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. This woman represented God's people throughout history, both the nation of Israel and the church. She was pregnant and about to give birth, but verse 3 reveals that she was in terrible danger. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. This dragon was Satan himself, described in verse 9 as that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. The 7 heads represented different forms of worldly power that Satan would use throughout history, while the 10 horns symbolized political authorities that would serve his purposes. Verse 4 describes the dragon's evil intention. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. The dragon wanted to destroy the child, who would eventually defeat him and establish God's kingdom on earth. But verse 5 shows that God protected the child. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. This child represented Jesus Christ, who was born into the world to defeat Satan, but was taken up to heaven after his resurrection. The woman fled into the wilderness, where God had prepared a place of protection for her during the final persecution. This represents how God will preserve his people during the most intense period of tribulation at the end of history. As the end times progress, John witnessed the rise of 2 powerful beings who would work together to deceive and control the entire world. Revelation chapter 13 verse 1 introduces the first beast. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. This beast represented a world political system that would unite all nations under a single authority. Verse 2 describes its nature. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. The leopard, bear, and lion represented the same world empires that Daniel had seen in his vision centuries earlier: Babylon, Media-Persia, and Greece. This final beast would combine the characteristics of all previous world empires into one supreme political authority empowered by Satan himself. Verse 7 reveals the extent of this beast's power. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. This wouldn't be just another political leader, it would be a world dictator with supernatural power who would persecute God's people globally. Revelation chapter 13, verse 11, introduces a second beast. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. This second beast would appear religious and gentle like a lamb, but would actually speak Satan's lies and promote the first beast's agenda. Verses 16 to 17 describe the mark that this second beast would require. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. This mark would be required for all economic activity. Without it, people wouldn't be able to buy food, pay rent, or engage in any commercial transactions. It would be a complete economic control system that would force people to choose between worshipping the beast or starving. Verse 18 gives us the most famous number in biblical prophecy. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Throughout history, people have tried to identify specific individuals whose names add up to 666 using various numbering systems. But the real meaning might be more symbolic. The number 7 represented perfection in Hebrew thought, so 666 might represent triple imperfection, humanity's repeated failure to achieve the perfection that only God possesses. It could also represent the ultimate human system that appears almost perfect, but falls just short of divine truth. One of the most complex symbols in Revelation is the great city called Babylon, which represents the world system that opposes God throughout history. Revelation chapter 17, verse 1 introduces this mystery. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." This harlot represents false religion that corrupts itself by seeking worldly power and wealth. Verse 5 identifies her, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. This wasn't necessarily the literal city of Babylon in Iraq, which had been destroyed centuries before John's vision. Instead, it represented the spiritual principle of rebellion against God that had begun at the Tower of Babel and would reach its climax in the end times. Verse 9 gives us a clue about her identity. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Throughout history, many interpreters have identified this as Rome, which was famous for being built on 7 hills, but it could also represent any major city or system that combines religious authority with political power. Revelation chapter 18, verse 2 announces Babylon's destruction, and he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. The fall of Babylon represents the complete collapse of all human systems that have opposed God throughout history. Verse 21 describes how sudden this collapse will be. Then a mighty angel took up a stone, like a great millstone, and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down, and shall not be found any more. The final series of judgments in Revelation involves 7 bowls of God's wrath being poured out on the earth. These represent the culmination of divine judgment, more intense than anything that came before. Revelation chapter 16 verse 2 describes the first bowl. So the first went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore. came upon the men who had the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. This judgment specifically targeted those who had chosen to follow the beast rather than God. The second and third bowls turned all water into blood, killing every living thing in the seas and making all fresh water undrinkable. The fourth bowl increased the heat of the sun so that people were scorched with great heat. Verse 9. The fifth bowl brought darkness upon the beast's kingdom, causing people to gnaw their tongues in pain. The sixth bowl dried up the Euphrates River to prepare the way for a final great battle. Verse 16 identifies the location of this ultimate conflict. And they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. This refers to the Valley of Megiddo in northern Israel, where many decisive battles had been fought throughout history. The seventh bowl brought the most devastating judgment of all. Verses 18 to 20 describe what happened, and there were noises and thunderings and lightnings. And there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on the earth. So violent was the earthquake. Now the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. This final earthquake would completely reshape the earth's geography, destroying all major cities and leveling every mountain and island. It would prepare the way for God to create a completely new heaven and earth. After all the judgments were complete, John witnessed the creation of a completely new reality. Revelation chapter 21 verse 1 describes what he saw. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also, there was no more. See, this wasn't just a renovation of the current world, it was a complete replacement. Everything that had been corrupted by sin and rebellion would be destroyed and replaced with something entirely new and perfect. Verse 2 introduces the crown jewel of this new creation. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down, out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. This city represented the eternal dwelling place where God would live with his people forever. The measurements of this city were extraordinary. Verse 16 tells us, the city is laid out as a square, its length is as great as its breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. Its length, breadth, and height are equal. This means the city was a perfect cube, 1,500 miles long, wide, and high. A cube was the shape of the Holy of Holies in both the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, representing the perfect presence of God. The New Jerusalem would be like a massive Holy of Holies, where God's presence filled everything completely. The city's walls were made of jasper, its foundations were adorned with 12 different precious stones, and its 12 gates were each made from a single massive pearl. The streets were pure gold, so refined that they appeared transparent like glass. In the center of this magnificent city, John saw something that connected back to the very beginning of human history. Revelation chapter 22 verse 1 describes it. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. This river wasn't just decorative. It was the source of eternal life, flowing directly from God's throne. It provided everything needed to sustain the perfect life that God's people would enjoy forever. Verse 2 reveals what grew beside this river. In the middle of its street, and on either side of the river, was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. This was the same tree of life that had grown in the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve sinned. After they disobeyed God, they were banished from Eden specifically to prevent them from eating from this tree and living forever in their sinful condition. Genesis 3:22-24. Now, in the New Jerusalem, the tree of life would be accessible again. But instead of just one tree, there would be many trees lining both sides of the river. They would produce fruit continuously, providing endless nourishment for God's people. The mention of leaves for the healing of the nations is interesting because verse 4 tells us there will be no more curse. This suggests that the effects of sin and rebellion that have damaged human relationships and national conflicts throughout history will be completely healed and restored. Verse 3 confirms this hope. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. The curse that began in Eden will finally be completely removed, and humanity will return to the perfect relationship with God that was always intended. The final mystery of Revelation points to the ultimate resolution of all the conflicts and questions that have plagued human history. Every injustice will be corrected, every tear will be wiped away, and God's perfect plan for creation will finally be complete. The mysteries that have puzzled humanity for thousands of years will be fully revealed, and those who have remained faithful to God through all the trials and tribulations will understand everything perfectly as they live forever in his presence. This seventh and final mystery reminds us that no matter how dark or confusing the present world may seem, God has already written the ending to the story. His purposes will be accomplished, his justice will be satisfied, and his people will share in his eternal victory over every form of evil and rebellion that has ever existed. We've reached the end of our journey through the 7 most incredible mysteries of the Bible. We've traveled from the days before the flood, when giants walked the earth, to the glorious future of the New Jerusalem, where every tear will be wiped away. We met Melchizedek, the king without origin, who pointed to the eternal Messiah. We witnessed Ezekiel's impossible visions and Paul's indescribable experience in the third heaven. We discovered the lost secrets of the Urim and Thummim and the supernatural power of the Ark of the Covenant. Finally, we unraveled the complex symbols of Revelation that reveal God's ultimate plan for humanity. These mysteries show us that the Bible is much more than an ordinary book. It's a treasure filled with supernatural secrets that continue to impact our lives today. Each mystery reveals a different aspect of God's character and his eternal plan for humanity. If this journey through biblical mysteries has touched your heart and expanded your understanding of Scripture, don't keep this discovery to yourself. Click the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos about the most fascinating secrets of the Bible. Turn on the notification bell to be the first to know when we publish new biblical mysteries. And please share this video with your friends and family. How many people do you know who have never heard about the Nephilim, about Melchizedek, or about the supernatural powers of the Ark of the Covenant? By sharing, you're helping other people discover the extraordinary truths that God has hidden in His Word for us to find. Leave a comment telling us which of these 7 mysteries impressed you the most and what other biblical mysteries you'd like us to explore in future videos. Your participation is very important for us to continue revealing the deepest secrets of Scripture. Until the next biblical mystery, may God bless your life and continue revealing His secrets to you through His Word. Don't forget, subscribe, share, and continue with us on this incredible journey through God's mysteries.